So things like that will change, and how we are part of the support for the monarchy may change slightly.
Princess Anne has always been the royal family's most dedicated worker. She completes more official duties than almost anyone else in the monarchy. She never complains, never seeks attention, and never stops. But recently, something made it change completely. Princess Anne shocked the nation when news broke that she suddenly cut off all her royal duties. Every meeting, every public visit, every event, gone with one decision. No details were shared. But what could make the toughest royal in Britain abandon her duties so suddenly? What family crisis was so devastating that it broke the one person who never breaks? Join us as we find out what happened inside the royal family that made Princess Anne step back so fast. The sudden cancellation. On one very October morning, life began normally at Gatcombe Park, the private residence of Princess Anne in Gloucestershire. Staff members followed their usual routines, preparing for another busy week of royal duties. The Princess Royal had 17 engagements scheduled over the next 14 days. Her calendar included charity visits, military ceremonies, and official openings across England and Scotland. Anne maintained one of the most demanding schedules of any royal family member, despite being 75 years old. Her commitment to duty was legendary all over the kingdom. Princess Anne came downstairs at her usual early hour and reviewed the day's schedule over breakfast. She was supposed to travel to Manchester that afternoon for a hospital visit. The following day included presenting awards to volunteers at a community centre in Leeds. Everything appeared normal as her protection officers prepared the vehicles for departure. Anne finished her tea and excused herself to make some private telephone calls before leaving. She went to her study and closed the door behind her. 30 minutes later, Anne emerged from the study looking pale and shaken. She walked directly to her private secretary's office without speaking to anyone else. The brief conversation that followed lasted less than 5 minutes. Anne then returned to her private quarters and did not come back downstairs. Her private secretary immediately began making urgent telephone calls. The tone of voice and rapid conversation indicated something serious had occurred. Staff members exchanged worried glances but continued their work without asking questions. Within an hour, official notifications went out to every organization expecting Princess Anne over the next 2 months. The cancellations came through formal channels with identical wording. The messages stated that Princess Anne would be unable to fulfill scheduled engagements due to personal unforeseen circumstances. No additional explanation or detail was given. No timeline for resuming duties was mentioned. The abruptness and scope of the cancellations shocked everyone who received them. Palace officials at Buckingham Palace learned about the mass cancellations at the same time as the organizations involved. No advance warning had been given to the King's office or to other senior royal staff. This breach of normal protocol indicated the emergency nature of whatever had occurred. Senior officials immediately tried contacting Gatcombe Park for clarification. They needed to understand the situation and coordinate an appropriate public response. The calls went to Anne's private secretary, who provided minimal information and refused to speculate about causes. The logistical challenge of replacing Princess Anne at 17 different engagements became immediately obvious. Other working royals already carried full schedules of their own commitments. Some events could be postponed, but others involved dates that could not be changed. Military ceremonies had been planned months in advance with hundreds of personnel involved. Charity organizations had coordinated their entire year around the confirmed royal visit. The cancellations created disappointment and confusion throughout the organizations affected. News of the cancellations reached media outlets by early afternoon. Royal correspondents began making inquiries about what had happened. The lack of explanation in the official notices prompted immediate speculation about possible causes. Reporters contacted their sources within palace circles seeking information. Nobody seemed to know anything concrete about why Princess Anne had withdrawn from all duties. The mystery deepened as hours passed without any response from official channels. Buckingham Palace issued a brief statement late in the afternoon confirming the cancellations. The statement repeated the same language about personal unforeseen circumstances without elaboration. Palace officials said they would provide updates when appropriate but had nothing further to share at present. The vague response did little to satisfy public curiosity. Social media platforms filled with theories and speculation about what could cause such drastic action from someone known for never missing commitments. Princess Anne's reputation for dedication made the cancellations particularly shocking to those who knew her work. She regularly completed more official engagements than any other royal family member except King Charles himself. She traveled constantly despite her age and never complained about the demanding pace. Her work ethic had earned respect from palace staff, military personnel, and workers across the country. The idea that she would cancel everything suggested something very serious had occurred. Royal historians noted that Princess Anne had never taken extended leave from duties in her entire working life. She continued performing engagements even during difficult periods such as her divorce from Mark Phillips. She maintained her schedule through various family scandals and personal challenges over the decades. Her consistency and reliability were defining characteristics of her royal service. The current cancellations represented a complete break from established patterns for over 50 years. Organizations that had been expecting Princess Anne scrambled to adjust their plans. Some decided to proceed with events without royal attendance. Others chose to postpone until her return to duties became possible. The uncertainty about timing made planning extremely difficult. Nobody knew whether the absence would last weeks, months, or potentially longer. The lack of information prevented proper contingency planning. Staff members at Gatcombe Park continued their duties while maintaining strict silence about what had occurred. They received clear instructions not to discuss anything with outsiders. The household operated normally on the surface, but the atmosphere felt heavy with unspoken tension. Princess Anne remained in her private quarters and did not appear for meals or her usual activities. Her children were notified about the situation but did not visit immediately. The sense of crisis permeated the entire residence. Evening news broadcasts featured the cancellations as a major story. Royal experts appeared on television programs discussing what might have gone wrong. Most assumed some kind of health issue either affecting Princess Anne directly or involving a close family member. The lack of valid information allowed speculation to flourish unchecked. The palace's refusal to provide details created a vacuum that gossip and rumor quickly filled. The situation became the main topic of conversation among people interested in the royal family. The family meeting at Balmoral. The summons to Balmoral Castle came through encrypted messages to senior royal family members late on the next day. King Charles requested immediate attendance for an emergency family meeting. The unusual timing and urgent nature of the request left no room for delay or excuse. Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and Prince Andrew were told to arrive by the following evening. The message indicated a matter of extreme sensitivity requiring face-to-face discussion away from London and media attention. Princess Anne made the journey north to Scotland with visible reluctance. Her protection officers noted her withdrawal during the long drive from Gloucestershire. She sat silently in the back seat, staring out the window for hours. The normal rest stops were shortened as Anne wanted to complete the journey as quickly as possible. When the convoy finally reached Balmoral's gates, Anne's face showed strain that years of public service had taught her to hide. She entered the castle and went directly to her assigned quarters without greeting anyone. King Charles arrived from London looking equally troubled by whatever situation had prompted this gathering. He spent time in private consultation with his most trusted advisors before the family meeting began. The king understood that his role as both monarch and brother would be tested by the discussions ahead. He needed to balance family loyalty with institutional responsibilities. The weight of those competing obligations showed in his expression as he prepared for the difficult conversations to come. Prince Edward and his wife Sophie arrived together from their home in Surrey. They had been given minimal information about why the meeting was necessary. Edward appeared concerned but composed as they entered Balmoral. Sophie stayed close to her husband, knowing that family tensions often emerged during these private gatherings. They joined the others in the drawing room that had been designated for the meeting. The formal setting emphasized the seriousness of what was about to occur. Prince Andrew was the last to arrive at Balmoral after traveling from Royal Lodge in Windsor. His demeanor suggested irritation at being summoned rather than concern about family matters. He greeted his siblings with perfunctory courtesy before taking a seat. The existing rift between Andrew and other family members was evident from the moment he entered the room. Nobody made small talk or attempted to lighten the atmosphere with casual conversation. King Charles opened the meeting by addressing the situation that had developed over the previous days. He outlined concerns that had been brought to his attention regarding family responsibilities and estate matters. His words were carefully chosen, but the underlying message was clear. Decisions needed to be made about how certain properties and resources would be managed going forward. These issues had created conflict between family members and required immediate resolution. Princess Anne listened to her brother's opening remarks with increasing tension visible in her posture. When Charles finished speaking, Anne responded with barely controlled emotion. She explained her perspective on the matters under discussion and why she found certain proposals completely unacceptable. Her voice remained steady, but the anger in her words was unmistakable. She directed much of her response toward Prince Andrew without looking directly at him. The atmosphere in the room became charged as Anne continued speaking. She detailed conversations and agreements that she believed had been violated. She expressed disappointment and frustration with how certain family members had handled sensitive situations. Her usual diplomatic restraint gave way to raw honesty about feelings she had suppressed for years. The other family members sat in uncomfortable silence as Anne's grievances poured out. Prince Andrew attempted to defend his position and actions when Anne finally paused. His response was defensive and dismissive of her concerns. He framed her reaction as excessive and unreasonable given the circumstances. The exchange between Anne and Andrew quickly escalated beyond civil discourse. Old resentments and accumulated frustrations surfaced rapidly. Prince Edward tried unsuccessfully to add in calmer perspectives into the heated discussion. King Charles attempted to moderate between his siblings, but found himself drawn into the conflict. Anne challenged him directly about his handling of family matters since becoming king. She questioned whether he truly understood the implications of decisions he had made or supported. Charles responded with his own frustration at being caught between impossible positions. The conversation spiraled beyond the original issues into broader questions about family dynamics and responsibilities. The meeting continued for more than 3 hours without reaching any resolution. Voices were raised repeatedly despite the formal setting. Sophie left the room at one point, unable to continue witnessing the family conflict. Prince Edward followed her shortly after, recognizing that his presence was not helping the situation. King Charles, Princess Anne, and Prince Andrew remained locked in circular arguments that went nowhere productive. Princess Anne finally stood and announced she was leaving. She stated clearly that she would not participate in any arrangement that accommodated what she considered unreasonable demands. She told Andrew directly that she had no intention of speaking with him again unless he practically changed his approach. Anne looked at King Charles with disappointment before walking out of the room. Her departure ended the meeting without any agreements or path forward. Anne returned to her quarters and remained there for the rest of the evening. She declined dinner with the family and asked not to be disturbed. Staff members brought a tray to her room, which went mostly untouched. Anne spent the night alone processing everything that had been said. The family conflict had reached a breaking point that seemed impossible to repair. The emotional toll of the confrontation left her tired and uncertain about what should happen next. King Charles sat alone in his study long after everyone else had retired. He reviewed the meeting in his mind, trying to identify where things had gone so badly wrong. His position as king complicated his ability to act purely as a brother. The institutional considerations could not be ignored, even when dealing with family matters. Charles understood that Anne felt betrayed by his inability to fully support her position. The rift between them added to the burden he already carried. The following morning, Princess Anne left Balmoral before breakfast, without saying goodbye to anyone. Her staff had packed during the night and the cars were ready at dawn. She departed the estate while most of the family still slept. The abrupt exit showed how badly the meeting had failed. Anne returned to Gatcombe Park more distressed than when she had left. The emotional blow of the family conflict compounded whatever had initially caused her to cancel all engagements. And now things were about to get much more difficult. The hidden health crisis. The telephone call that changed everything came to Princess Anne the previous morning from a private medical office in London. The caller delivered test results that had been urgently processed over the previous weekend. Princess Anne listened in silence as medical terminology and prognosis information poured through the phone. The diagnosis involved her husband, Vice Admiral Sir Timothy Lawrence. The condition was serious and required immediate medical intervention with an uncertain long-term outlook. Timothy had been experiencing symptoms for several weeks that both he and Anne had attributed to normal aging. Persistent fatigue, occasional dizziness, and unexplained weight loss seemed minor enough to ignore at first. Anne had suggested he see a doctor, but Timothy kept postponing appointments due to his own busy schedule. He finally agreed to comprehensive testing after Anne insisted, following an incident where he nearly collapsed during a private event at Gatcombe Park. The battery of tests revealed cardiovascular problems that doctors classified as severe. Blockages in major arteries posed immediate risk of heart attack or stroke. The medical team recommended emergency surgery to address the most critical issues. Beyond the immediate intervention, Timothy would need to make dramatic lifestyle changes and likely face ongoing health challenges. The prognosis included possibilities that Anne found terrifying to contemplate. Anne felt overwhelming guilt for not forcing Timothy to seek medical attention earlier. She replayed conversations in her mind where she had noticed his declining energy but accepted his reassurances. Her demanding schedule and constant travel had prevented her from being as attentive as she now wished. The realization that she might have prevented the situation from becoming so serious consumed her thoughts. She blamed herself for prioritizing royal duties over her husband's well-being. Timothy was admitted to a private hospital in London immediately after the diagnosis. The surgical team scheduled procedures to begin within 48 hours. Anne traveled to London and took a room at the hospital to remain close during the critical period. She sat with Timothy as doctors explained the procedures and associated risks. The medical information was technical and confusing. Anne held Timothy's hand while maintaining the composed exterior she had perfected over decades of public life. The decision about public disclosure became immediately complicated. Timothy's position as a retired naval officer and royal spouse meant some level of public interest in his health. However, Anne fiercely protected their privacy and wanted to shield Timothy from media attention during a vulnerable time. Palace officials argued that some announcement would be necessary to explain Anne's cancelled engagements. Anne, however, refused to allow any statement that mentioned Timothy's condition specifically. The surgery took place over 2 days, with Anne waiting anxiously through each procedure. Medical staff provided updates during breaks between surgical interventions. The operations addressed the most critical blockages, but additional problems were discovered that would require future procedures. Timothy's recovery would be measured in months rather than weeks. The limitations on his activities would be permanent, even under the best outcome scenarios. Anne remained at the hospital throughout Timothy's initial recovery period. She slept in a chair beside his bed and refused suggestions to return home for rest. The usually energetic and active princess sat motionless for hours watching monitors and waiting for Timothy to wake from anesthesia. When he finally regained consciousness, Anne allowed herself to show emotion she had been suppressing. The fear of losing him had been heavy, despite her outward calm. Timothy's condition stabilized after the first critical days but remained serious. Doctors emphasized the need for complete rest and stress reduction during recovery. They made clear that returning to any normal activities would take considerable time. Anne understood that supporting Timothy through recovery would require her constant presence and attention. The demanding schedule she normally maintained would be impossible to continue while providing the care Timothy needed. The conversation about Anne's royal duties became unavoidable as Timothy improved enough to discuss practical matters. He expressed concern about her canceling engagements on his behalf. Anne dismissed his worries and made clear that he was her absolute priority. She explained that she had already canceled everything for 2 months and would extend that period if necessary. Timothy tried to argue, but lacked the energy for prolonged discussion. Anne's children visited the hospital to see Timothy and support their mother. The family gathered in the private room and discussed how to manage the situation going forward. Everyone agreed that Anne needed to step back from royal duties temporarily. However, the emotional impact on Anne herself became noticeable during these conversations. She appeared exhausted and emotionally fragile in ways her children had rarely witnessed. The crisis had broken through her usual strong persona. The guilt Anne carried about not recognizing Timothy's symptoms earlier continued affecting her mental state. She repeatedly mentioned things she should have noticed or actions she should have taken. Her children tried reassuring her that she was not responsible for Timothy's health problems. Anne could not accept their reassurances and remained convinced that her neglect had contributed to the severity of the situation. The psychological burden compounded the stress of Timothy's medical crisis. Doctors began discussing long-term care plans as Timothy's immediate crisis passed. He would need cardiac rehabilitation and significant lifestyle modifications. Diet, exercise, and stress management would all require careful attention. Anne would need to adjust her own life to support these changes. The reality that Timothy might never fully return to his previous level of health settled over both of them. The privacy around Timothy's condition remained absolute, despite intense media speculation. Palace officials fielded constant inquiries about Princess Anne's canceled engagements. Reporters pursued various theories about what had happened. Anne's private secretary deflected questions without confirming or denying anything. The wall of silence frustrated journalists, but protected the family during an incredibly difficult time. Anne finally left the hospital after 10 days when Timothy was transferred to a private recovery facility. She traveled between Gatcombe Park and the facility daily to spend time with him. The exhaustion from emotional strain and disrupted sleep showed in her appearance. Staff members at Gatcombe noticed how quiet and withdrawn she had become. The princess, who normally radiated energy and purpose, seemed diminished by the weight she carried. Timothy's slow progress toward recovery provided some hope, but the uncertainty remained difficult. Anne tried to focus on the positive developments while preparing herself for a long, difficult journey ahead. The realization that their lives had changed permanently was unavoidable. Nothing would return to the way it had been before the diagnosis. Anne faced the challenge of rebuilding a life that accommodated Timothy's health needs while fulfilling her responsibilities to the crown, and she has to figure it out fast. The rift with Prince Andrew. The underlying tensions between Princess Anne and Prince Andrew had simmered beneath the surface for years before finally erupting at Balmoral. The conflict centered on Royal Lodge, the sprawling Windsor property where Andrew had lived since 2003. King Charles wanted Andrew to vacate the residence and move to smaller accommodations more appropriate for a non-working royal. Andrew refused repeatedly despite mounting pressure from palace officials and his brother, the king. Princess Anne had been brought into discussions because of her reputation for straight talk and her position as Andrew's older sister. Anne initially met with Andrew privately to discuss the Royal Lodge situation and broader questions about his financial arrangements. Andrew received an annual allowance from King Charles that Anne and other family members considered overly generous given his diminished status. Anne suggested that Andrew needed to accept reality about his position and make appropriate adjustments, but Andrew responded with defensiveness and entitlement that infuriated his sister. The conversation revealed deeper disagreements about Andrew's behavior over the years and his refusal to acknowledge consequences. Anne brought up the Jeffrey Epstein scandal and how Andrew's poor judgment had damaged the entire royal family. She expressed frustration that Andrew seemed to feel no genuine remorse or understanding of the harm he had caused. Andrew dismissed her concerns and accused her of self-righteousness. The meeting ended badly with both siblings angry. King Charles asked Anne to try again after the first conversation failed. Charles himself had reached an impasse with Andrew, who refused to budge on any issue. The king hoped that Anne's blunt approach might break through where diplomatic efforts had failed. Anne reluctantly agreed but warned Charles that another attempt would likely make things worse rather than better. She predicted that Andrew would respond to pressure with increased stubbornness. The situation escalated when Andrew began making demands rather than accepting compromises. He insisted that if he left Royal Lodge, he should receive comparable accommodation elsewhere. He wanted financial guarantees to maintain his current lifestyle, suggested properties that were completely inappropriate given his status as a disgraced former working royal. Anne found his demands outrageous and told Charles that appeasing Andrew would set terrible precedents. Andrew then made the situation far worse by attempting to manipulate family dynamics to his advantage. He reached out to other family members suggesting that Anne was being unreasonably harsh and that Charles was being influenced by her negativity. He portrayed himself as a victim of family ganging up on him. Several relatives who were not fully informed about the situation expressed sympathy for Andrew's position. This manipulation infuriated Anne when she learned about it. The emergency meeting at Balmoral was called partly to address the Royal Lodge impasse and Andrew's continuing intransigence. King Charles hoped that bringing everyone together would force resolution. Anne attended the meeting prepared for confrontation. She had decided that further attempts at diplomacy with Andrew were pointless. Her approach would be to lay out harsh truths regardless of how Andrew reacted. During the Balmoral meeting, Andrew presented a proposal that shocked everyone in the room. He suggested that he should receive a formal role representing the family at certain events in exchange for cooperating on housing. He argued that the family needed more working royals and that he could fill that gap. The proposal demonstrated such strong lack of awareness that Anne initially thought he was joking. When she realized Andrew was serious, her anger became visible. Anne responded to Andrew's proposal with withering criticism. She outlined in detail why he would never again represent the royal family in any capacity. She brought up specific incidents and poor decisions that made him a liability rather than an asset. She told Andrew that his reputation was irreparably damaged and that he needed to accept permanent retirement from public life. Her words were harsh, but reflected reality that others had been too diplomatic to state so plainly. Andrew reacted to Anne's criticism with rage rather than reflection. He accused her of personal vendetta and suggested she was jealous of the attention he had received over the years. He brought up old family conflicts and made personal attacks on Anne's character and choices. The argument descended into a level of hostility rarely seen among the members of the royal family, even in private. Years of accumulated resentments poured out from both sides. King Charles attempted to intervene and restore order, but found himself targeted by both Anne and Andrew. Anne criticized Charles for not handling Andrew firmly years earlier. Andrew accused Charles of betraying him and abandoning family loyalty. The three-way conflict spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control. Prince Edward's attempts to mediate were brushed aside by all parties. The meeting had become a disaster. Anne's breaking point came when Andrew suggested that she should provide financial support from her own resources if she felt so strongly about him leaving Royal Lodge. The idea that she should subsidize his lifestyle after everything else enraged her beyond measure. She stood up and told Andrew she was finished attempting to help someone who refused all responsibility for his situation. She declared that she would not speak to him again until he showed genuine change in attitude and behavior. The declaration of cutting off contact shocked everyone, including Andrew himself. Anne rarely made such absolute statements about family relationships. Her willingness to completely sever communication with her brother indicated how thoroughly he had exhausted her patience. King Charles tried to walk back Anne's statement, but she refused to soften her position. She was done with Andrew and made that very clear. Anne left Balmoral the next morning without resolving anything regarding Andrew or Royal Lodge. The rift between them was now complete and public within family circles. Other royals would be forced to choose sides or attempt to remain neutral in the ongoing conflict. The family unity that King Charles desperately wanted to maintain had shattered over Andrew's refusal to accept his diminished circumstances. The aftermath of the Balmoral meeting left Anne emotionally devastated. The combination of Timothy's health crisis and the brutal family conflict overwhelmed her usual resilience. She returned to Gatcombe Park feeling betrayed by Andrew's behavior and disappointed by Charles's inability to handle the situation effectively. The emotional blow from the family rift added to everything else she was dealing with regarding Timothy's condition. Andrew's response to the confrontation was to dig in even more firmly on his positions. He refused to consider any compromise on Royal Lodge or his financial arrangements. He complained to anyone who would listen about being treated unfairly by Anne and Charles. At his complete lack of self-awareness ensured the conflict would continue indefinitely. The royal family faced internal division at a time when unity was desperately needed. Meanwhile, Anne has made up her mind to concentrate on her life. Anne's decision about her future. Princess. Anne sat alone in her study at Gatcombe Park during the third week of October, reviewing her entire life of royal service. The walls displayed photographs from decades of engagements across every continent. Plaques and awards covered surfaces commemorating her work with hundreds of organizations. The physical evidence of 50 years of dedication surrounded her. Yet Anne found herself questioning whether continuing that same path made any sense given recent events. The weight of Timothy's health crisis and the family rift had forced a reckoning she could no longer avoid. The immediate 2-month cancellation of engagements had been a crisis response to unusual circumstances. Anne had acted on instinct to clear space for dealing with Timothy's recovery and the emotional trauma from Balmoral. However, as days passed, she began considering whether the break should become permanent rather than temporary. The relentless schedule she had maintained for decades suddenly seemed unsustainable and perhaps unwise. The question of what she truly owed to the institution versus what she owed to herself demanded honest examination. Anne's typical year involved more than 500 official engagements across the United Kingdom and internationally. She traveled constantly between charity visits, military ceremonies, and organizational commitments. Her role as patron or president of more than 300 organizations created endless demands on her time and energy. At 75 years old, she had maintained a pace that broke people half her age. The costs of that commitment had always seemed worth paying until Timothy's diagnosis forced her to reconsider priorities. Timothy's doctors had been clear that his recovery required a stable, low-stress environment. Anne's constant travel and demanding schedule created the opposite of what he needed. If she resumed her previous pace, she would be absent for extended periods during the critical months of his rehabilitation. The choice between supporting her husband and fulfilling royal obligations seemed impossible to reconcile. Anne had always believed she could balance personal and professional responsibilities. Recent events proved that assumption was wrong. The family conflict with Prince Andrew added another layer to her deliberations about the future. Anne felt weighed down by decades of managing difficult family dynamics while maintaining a public facade of unity. The confrontation at Balmoral had broken something inside her that she did not know how to repair. The idea of continuing to smile for cameras and represent an institution that tolerated Andrew's behavior indefinitely seemed increasingly untenable. Her anger at the situation had not diminished with time. Anne's relationship with King Charles had also suffered damage that would take time to heal. She understood the impossible position he occupied as both brother and monarch. However, his inability or unwillingness to decisively handle Andrew frustrated her deeply. Anne had always been Charles's strongest supporter within the family. The erosion of that alliance left her feeling isolated and unsupported. Continuing to work within the royal framework seemed less appealing without the close partnership she had shared with her brother. The practical implications of Anne reducing or ending her royal duties were significant. She was the hardest-working member of the royal family after King Charles himself. Her withdrawal would leave enormous gaps in coverage that other royals could not easily fill. Prince William and Catherine already carried heavy schedules. Prince Edward and Sophie had increased their workload but could not absorb Anne's entire portfolio. The monarchy would struggle to maintain its presence across all the causes and organizations Anne currently served. Anne spent hours reviewing her commitments, trying to identify what was truly essential versus what she did from habit or obligation. Some organizations relied heavily on her personal involvement and would suffer from her absence. Others had grown comfortable with royal patronage, but could function perfectly well without it. Anne began making lists of engagements she considered valuable versus those she attended purely because they were on her calendar. The exercise clarified how much of her time went to activities that made little meaningful difference. The mental health effect of recent events could not be ignored in Anne's calculations. She recognized symptoms of burnout and emotional exhaustion that she had never experienced before. The combination of pain over her husband's condition, anger about Andrew, and disappointment with Charles had depleted her reserves. Continuing to perform public duties while carrying such emotional weight seemed both unhealthy and dishonest. Anne prided herself on authenticity and struggled with the idea of presenting a false front to the public. Financial considerations played a role in Anne's thinking about her future. She received funding for official duties that would presumably end if she significantly reduced her role. However, her personal resources from various sources provided sufficient income to maintain Gatcombe Park and her household. Timothy's naval pension and their investments meant they could live comfortably without royal funding. The financial independence gave Anne freedom to make choices based on personal values rather than economic necessity. Anne's children entered the conversation about her future during a family gathering at Gatcombe Park. Peter and Zara both expressed support for whatever decision their mother made regarding royal duties. They acknowledged the toll that decades of service had taken on her personal life. Both encouraged Anne to prioritize her own well-being and her relationship with Timothy. Their support gave Anne permission to consider options she might otherwise have dismissed as selfish or irresponsible. The conversation with her children turned to practical questions about what reduced royal duties would actually mean. Anne could maintain patronages with certain organizations while declining others. She could limit travel to events within a reasonable distance from home. She could reduce her annual number of engagements to something more manageable, like 200 instead of 500. Complete retirement seemed unnecessary, but strategic reduction could address many of her concerns while maintaining some public role. King Charles learned about Anne's deliberations through indirect channels before she spoke with him directly. He requested a private meeting at Windsor Castle to discuss her intentions. Anne agreed reluctantly, knowing the conversation would be difficult. Charles needed to understand her perspective, but she doubted he would truly accept her reasoning. The institutional imperatives that drove his thinking conflicted with the personal priorities that now drove hers. The meeting between Anne and Charles took place in a private sitting room away from staff and advisors. Anne explained her thinking about reducing her royal role significantly going forward. She outlined the reasons, including her husband's health, her own exhaustion, and the damage from family conflicts. Charles listened, but responded with concerns about the impact on the monarchy's public presence. He asked Anne to reconsider and suggested that taking more time before making permanent decisions would be wise. Anne recognized that Charles was asking her to prioritize institutional needs over personal ones, as she had done throughout her entire adult life. The request felt familiar, but no longer compelling. She told Charles that she had given the monarchy 50 years of dedicated service. The time had come to focus on the remaining years she had with Timothy and on healing from recent trauma. Charles's disappointment was visible, but Anne felt surprisingly unbothered by it. She had made her decision. The official announcement about Anne's future role would wait until after the initial 2-month period of cancelled engagements ended. Palace communications staff began preparing statements that would frame the changes positively while acknowledging the shift. Anne would resume some duties, but on a very reduced scale. She would maintain involvement with organizations closest to her heart, while stepping back from hundreds of other commitments. The decision represented the most significant change in her royal role since she began official duties in her early 20s. Princess Anne felt both relief and sadness about the path she had chosen. Relief came from knowing she could prioritize her family's own well-being. Sadness came from acknowledging that this chapter of her life was ending differently than she had imagined. She had always planned to continue working until physically unable to do so. Recent events forced acceptance that continuing at her previous pace would destroy rather than fulfill her. The decision to step back was not surrender, but rather self-preservation. Anne hoped that understanding would come in time from those who questioned her choice. Princess Anne's decision to step back from her relentless schedule marked the end of an era for the British royal family. The combination of her husband's devastating health crisis and the irreparable rift with Prince Andrew had broken through her barricade. After 50 years of service, she chose herself and Timothy over duty to the crown. The cancellation of hundreds of engagements sent shock through the monarchy, leaving King Charles scrambling to fill the void left by his hardest-working sister. Anne's withdrawal forced the royal family to confront uncomfortable truths about sacrifice, loyalty, and the human cost of service to an ancient institution. Do you think Princess Anne was right for wanting Prince Andrew to vacate the royal lodge? Let us know your views in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.